Hello again, friends, and welcome to another edition of If This Car Could Talk. In today's episode, we're bringing you the history of one of the most innovative engine designs ever produced, the hemispherical headed V8 by the Chrysler Corporation. In my opinion, this engine had several distinct design eras. In this video, we'll be bringing you the first chapter of the development of these powerful beasts from the 1950s era, when Hemis were commonly found under the hoods of Chrysler, DeSoto, and Dodge cars from 1951 through 1958. The later Hemi engines of the 1960s that powered some of the most collectible and valuable Dodge and Plymouth models will not be covered in this video. Let's start out by defining what a hemispherical cylinder head design is and why it generally makes more power than a conventional head. This cylinder head's combustion chamber has a domed shape with larger intake and exhaust valves, and a chamber that allows for a more complete and efficient combustion, which makes more power. The only drawback to this design is that the valve train is more complex and there is more machine work required at the factory over a conventional cylinder head. Over the years, many other manufacturers had similar designs, but many were not truly hemispherical in design. For example, Ford's 427 SOHC and the Boss 429 engines were both a semi-Hemi design. As early as 1901, auto builders were experimenting with many different engine componentry designs for lighter weight, more efficiency, assembly speed, and other factors. This included various cylinder head designs like a hemispherical combustion chamber. It wasn't until Chrysler built V16 aircraft engines and air-cooled tanks with V12s using this cylinder head design during World War II that the engineering was perfected. After building untold quantities of these early Hemis for heavy-duty military use, that engineers were able to see exactly how and why these engines would fail, during what can be considered the ultimate test of an engine's durability and reliability under extreme conditions. Much was learned, and improvements were made continually as needed. Today we'll be looking at all of the various cubic inch displacement engines offered by each division year to year, as well as horsepower ratings with 2, 4, or 8 barrel carburation. Most of these engines were either standard or optional in different models, but this video will focus more on the engine information. If we were to list each model and sub-series that the Hemi could be ordered in, this video would go on for over an hour. These engines were not called Hemis by Chrysler. Rather, this was a colloquial term assigned to them by the general public during the 1950s. By the time the 426 Hemi came into production in 1964, Chrysler's marketing people adopted the term. It's still used today and is arguably one of the best-known automotive references recognized by car enthusiasts and even those poor, misguided people that are not. Let's kick it off with Chrysler. In 1951, this division was the first to mass-produce a Hemi-headed V8 engine. It was a 331 cubic inch engine with 2-barrel carburation, making an astounding for the time 180 horsepower. It was called Firepower and was labeled as such on each valve cover. It was the perfect power plant to install in Chrysler's flagship luxury cars like the Imperial and the New Yorker, and available optionally in the Saratoga. Chrysler put a lot of effort into making the car-buying public aware of this fresh design, making at least 2 different technical brochures available in showrooms and as mailers for prospective customers. Calling it, quote, the sensation of the century, unquote, nearly 50,000 cars were sold that first year. For more conservative buyers, cars in the lower series were still produced with the Flathead 6. For the next 2 years, the 331 carried on while engineers were formulating plans to increase the power output. This was necessary to stay competitive as the horsepower wars began in earnest in Detroit. Early hot rodders and racers quickly snapped up any of these engines they could find in wrecking yards. and aftermarket speed parts suppliers like Edelbrock, Isky Cams, Offenhausers, and others engineered and mass-produced components that could really wake up these early Hemis, especially in lightweight cars like the Model A's and early Ford V8s. In 1954, Chrysler engineers kept the two-barrel 331 as before, but were now offering a four-barrel version with a beefier bottom end and a more efficient exhaust system that put out 235 horses. But the ultimate 331 would be offered the following year in what many automotive historians consider to be the first personal luxury high-performance coupes on the market that seated more than two people comfortably. The 1955 Chrysler C300 hardtop featuring twin four-barrel carburation, a solid lift camshaft, and more, producing 300 horsepower. This car ignited the horsepower wars in a significant way. It was also the first of the letter series cars offered by Chrysler to appease a small group of clients who insisted on style, comfort, and performance. Unfortunately, at the time, more emphasis was being placed on these things rather than safety. That would come in a couple more years with features like padded dashes and visors, deep dish steering wheels and collapsible columns, seat belts, breakaway inside rearview mirrors, improved door latches, and more becoming standard equipment. These various Hemi engines also powered different industrial equipment like pumps, heavy machinery, heavy construction equipment, and even a civil air raid siren, commonly seen throughout the United States during the Cold War. It's reported that sirens powered by the 331 Hemi were some of the loudest ever produced, exceeding 135 decibels. In 1956, the cubic inch displacement was increased to 354, which became standard in both the Imperial and New Yorker, as a single four-barrel reaching 280 horsepower, and the standard 300B engine produced 340 horsepower. An option for the 300B this year gave ultra-wealthy owners right feet 355 horsepower to control. Reaching 1 horsepower per cubic inch was quite an accomplishment for this time period. In fact, this is the first time this was ever done in an American car. Needless to say, this engine was highly coveted by hot rodders of the late 1950s and early 60s. This was also the year all Chrysler-produced vehicles would use the superior 12-volt electrical systems for better performance and reliability. Also new in '56 is that all Chrysler-built cars and trucks with either a PowerFlight or a TorqueFlite automatic transmission now had the gear selector on the dashboard using push buttons. For the final year of Hemi availability, before the various overhead valve engines that would be used for decades into the future, the Chrysler version of the Hemi design was boosted to 392 cubic inches. Still called Firepower, in its standard form, it produced a very respectable 325 horsepower, but the 300C got 50 more horsepower using multiple carburetors, a solid lifter cam, and more. Until the modern era, this would be the last time a Chrysler model would have a Hemi under the hood. DeSoto Division. Chrysler's DeSoto division was created in 1928, bringing a 1929 model DeSoto 6 Series K to market. The Plymouth division offered its first car in 1928. Then the Depression mercilessly befell both the U.S. and the world economies for more than a decade. Almost unbelievably, Chrysler also obtained the Dodge Brothers' successful company in 1928 as well. No one saw those dark clouds of an economic crash looming at the tail end of the following year. Fortunately, the Dodge division almost single-handedly kept the corporation alive at the time because they offered cars, light and heavy-duty trucks, and chassis cab for the average American family. After surviving the Depression, World War II boosted the bottom line for many auto builders, including the new Chrysler Corporation. After the war, the divisions would each be repurposed for a specific niche within the industry. DeSoto was placed near the top, just below Chrysler. This meant that they would build and sell some very special automobiles at the time. This division lasted through 1961, which means they were still big players during the 1950s. They used several different Hemis for their cars in that decade. Unlike its parent company Chrysler, the first Hemi engine at DeSoto was in 1952. It was dubbed the Fire Dome 8 and displaced 276 cubic inches and was rated at 160 horsepower with a Carter 2-barrel carburetor. For buyers who wished to purchase a car with an engine they were more familiar with, DeSoto also offered the PowerMaster 6 in some models. Nothing changed for 1954 as DeSoto continued to sell enough cars to stay in business, at least for a while. In 1955, the most exciting and certainly most obvious new feature was the debut of the entire Chrysler Corporation's adapting ex-Pontiac and Studebaker designer Virgil Exner's new forward look, which modernized their styling to compete with the rest of the domestic automotive industry. Exner first came to Chrysler in 1949, and at the time, it normally took 3 to 5 years to bring a completely new model to market. Exner brought dozens of new cars to the market in 1955 for the country's number 3 automaker. In retrospect, when viewing many of the forward-look designs today, I think they're among the best looking in the American car market in the mid to late 50s. As far as power plant availability for these new beautifully styled cars, the reliable but very outdated PowerMaster 6 was dropped, and a larger Hemi V8 came on board. It was called the Fireflight and made 200 horsepower using a Carter 4-barrel carb, feeding fuel to 291 cubic inches. The junior engine was now the Fire Dome, which remained virtually unchanged from its debut 3 years earlier. This would be the first year that Hemi V8s would be available in the DeSoto line. For 1956, the beautiful DeSoto Adventurer was first seen in showrooms across the country. These cars all used the 341 cubic inch engine with a high for the time compression ratio of 9.5 to 1. A specially designed hydraulic lifter camshaft, a tuned exhaust, and dual 4-barrel Carter WCFB carburetors produced an impressive 320 horsepower. The 1956 Adventurer was the premier high-performance model available from DeSoto. It was the equivalent of the Chrysler 300 that year. The Adventurer would have its own engine to signify its market exclusivity, but all other models used the previous year's 341-inch engine. The 57 Adventurer increased its Hemi displacement to 345 cubes, producing 345 horsepower, and was in fact the first American car to do so using a standard available engine. Other companies were now also producing high horsepower engines that matched the displacement and horsepower rating 1-to-1. But all these engines were optional in various 1957 makes and models, not standard equipment like the Adventurer. For the Fire Dome and Fireflight series, all got a 330 cubic inch Hemi producing anywhere from 230 to 255 horsepower depending on the model. The new entry-level Fire Suite models used a 325 cubic inch poly-headed engine, which was produced by the Dodge division at the time. In 1958, the Chrysler division would be the only one to continue using a Hemi engine. The legendary 392 found exclusively in the 300D. Producing 380 horsepower as standard equipment with a dual carb setup, an optional electronic fuel injection system was available for a short while, boosting horsepower to 390. But this system proved very troublesome, and most were recalled and converted back to the dual quad induction setup. Dodge division. 1953 was the debut year for the Hemi for this division. Dubbed the Red Ram 8, it was a downsized cubic inch displacement from the Chrysler and DeSoto offerings. It came in at 241 cubes and produced a respectable 140 horsepower using regular fuel. It was designed for torque because this engine was also used in their various trucks as well. The only other choice for power at Dodge was the straight six called the Power Master, rated at 110 horsepower and used primarily in the Coronet and some of the trucks. The following year, the power teams that were available were unchanged. But 1955 would be a very noteworthy year for the Chrysler Corporation with the introduction of what is now known as the Poly engines. This was a revolutionary design and was made to compete with the newly introduced small block overhead V8 from Chevrolet, as well as the also new Pontiac 287 Strato Streak, while Cadillac and Oldsmobile continued upgrading their famous overhead valve V8s that had been in production since 1949. And Buick still had their famous nailhead design, while over at Ford, they had introduced the overhead valve Y-block V8s in the 1952 Lincolns, and then the entire 1954 Ford and Mercury lines used this engine design in various displacements until the FE came along in 1958. There were some independents that also had V8 power at the time, including Packard and Studebaker. It was certainly an exciting time in the automotive industry in America, where it seems more technical and mechanical innovations were seen than in the past 5 decades before. In 1955, Chrysler hemispherical cylinder heads were found on the older designed engines as well as the new Poly V8s. Depending on the series, Coronet buyers could have both the tried and true Getaway 6 available with either a 1 or a 2 barrel carburetor, or the 241 cubic inch Red Ram Hemi, putting out an impressive 175 horsepower. The Royal models got this engine as standard equipment. The top-of-the-line Custom Royal had the Super Red Ram engine displacing 270 cubic inches as standard fare. This was the one that hot rodders were seeking to find in salvage yards all over the country to power their mostly Ford pre-war coupes and roadsters, because it was the smallest in size and weight, making swaps very simple. For 1956, Dodge increased the Hemi's displacement to 315 cubic inches with a longer stroke and a taller raised deck block. On the base engines, they used polyspherical cylinder heads rather than the Hemi heads, displacing 270 horsepower and calling it the Red Ram. The Hemi engine now powered the Royal and Custom Royal series, and to differentiate the two, the Hemi was called the super-powered Super Red Ram V8. The optional high-performance D500 version had a single 4-barrel carburetor and a larger valve Dodge hemispherical heads. They were good for 285 horses, but a racier dual-quad model, dubbed the Super D500, reached a peak horsepower of 325. The D500 would also become a new model this year. Not much changed for Dodge engine offerings in 1957. With the polyhead engines being cheaper to produce, the Hemis were being phased out. At Dodge, this would be the final year for these engines. The Hemi would survive at Chrysler until the end of 1958. However, these Hemi engines had become legendary on racetracks and in hot rodding circles almost instantly, and for anyone building a traditional hot rod, nothing looks and sounds cooler than an early Chrysler-built Hemi V8 in any configuration. Add vintage speed parts like multiple carburation, upgraded ignition, tube headers, and a tasteful use of paint details and chrome, and you've got something that will instantly attract a crowd at any show. Of course, the Hemi design concept would go on into the 1960s to power many Dodge and Plymouth race cars, both on NASCAR tracks and on the local drag strip. That era lasted from 1964 to 1971. If correctly restored, they are some of the most coveted and valuable muscle cars for collectors. An interesting note here is that Plymouth never had a Hemi engine available during the 1950s, but they most certainly did in the 1960s with the legendary 426. The Hemi lives on in the modern era, seen in Ram pickups, in countless Dodge Challengers and Chargers, and even in some of the Chrysler division luxury models like the 300. Chrysler has offered non-production crate engines like the Elephant and others these past 20-plus years so that custom car builders can adapt a brand new Hemi engine into their newest creations. Chrysler even used the slogan, "That thing got a Hemi?" in 2004 and various other times, cementing the Hemi legend to an entirely new group of enthusiasts to the mystique of these iconic motors. Even non-car people know what it is, thanks to Chrysler's brilliant marketing. So tell us in the comments what your favorite Hemi is and why. Each have their dedicated and hardcore following, but all are revered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.